A plastic cool box like this is great for taking on picnics, but I wanted to leave mine here on the deck. So today's project in the Great British Woodshop is to build a fine piece of furniture to dress this up. I went looking for some design ideas for a wooden cool box and ended up in the north of England. We're about 5 or 6 miles south of the birthplace of the Beatles in Liverpool, and this is Speke Hall. Now Speke Hall is one of the oldest and best preserved timber frame buildings in the north of England, and it was the home of the Norris family for about 5 centuries. This impressive 25-yard facade and entryway was built by Edward Norris in 1598. This is an enormous kitchen. You can just imagine the amount of activity that was going on in here on a daily basis. And in fact, that's why these windows are set so high. It was to stop the workers in here from looking out, wasting time. Now, we take a lot of things for granted now, but in the 19th century, they were luxuries, one of which was sugar. And in fact, that's how the Watt family made their fortune in the West Indian sugar trade. Now, sugar used to come in a sugar cone, like this. And this medieval contraption here was used to lop off pieces of sugar to put into tea, I suppose. Or you could drag the sugar cone through the sharp edges to create some fine dust. Another luxury of the time was ice. And they used to deliver the ice wrapped in straw. And they'd put it in this chest, which is zinc lined. Now, this chest is so well insulated that it would keep the ice for up to 2 months. And I'm sure they used the ice in their drinks, but they also used it for another luxury of the time, ice cream. Well, as much as I like ice cream, this is going to be used to store some of my favourite drinks. I built it out of Iroko, which is a great outdoor wood. And the lid has tongue and groove panelling on it, and I beveled all the edges of the frame. Now, the whole project is built around that plastic cool box. I took off the lid and the handles and added some brass ones to the outside of the chest. We're going to begin by building the 4 posts. I've roughed out 4 posts and I've cut them all 80mm square, and I'm going to start surfacing them on the jointer. Now, I love power tools and woodworking gadgets of all sorts, but I treat them all with the greatest of respect, and you should too. The only time I ever remove the guard is to show you what I'm actually doing. It's an important safety feature and should otherwise always be left on. I buy my wood down at the timber yard rough sawn. It's cheaper and I can mill it to the exact dimensions that I want. Now, the only trouble with rough sawn timber is it's never flat. But if you've got the right tools in the wood shop, you can surface it yourself. The right tool to do that with is the jointer. Now, the first thing I'm looking for is a flat surface, or as flat a surface as I can get, and this one is rocking. But this side isn't. So that's the face that I'm going to surface first. That's what I'm looking for, a perfectly flat surface. By rotating the board and keeping it flat against the fence, I'll get 2 surfaces that are at 90 degrees to each other. The 2 sides I've passed through the jointer have now given me a face edge and a face side. I'll put that face side down on the thickness planer and run it through multiple times until I get down to the finished dimension of 75mm. To square up the 4th side, I'm going to run it through the table saw and then finish it up on the jointer. I'm going to square up one end and then slide the post down up against the stop, which is set at 496, and then make the final cut. The sides of the chest are made up of 2 rails, and the rails have tenons on each end, and a trench that receives this tongue and groove panelling. We're going to get started on cutting the rails. Well, here's one of the rails cut to length. Now, I've got 16 tenons to cut in this project, and to do that I'm going to use a mortise and tenon jig. Now, the first thing I want to do in setting up the jig is to mark a center line on this piece of stock. Now, the stock is 24mm wide, and so I want a line down the middle, obviously at 12mm. Now, this is important because it will indicate exactly where the tenon will be centered. Now, I can take this over to the jig, and this setup bar has a little tab on it, and that is an indicator of to where to stop the right height. So too far up, too far down, not good. just up so it's firm against the tab, and then tighten the clamp. Now I've got a number of choices of what size tenon width I want to use with this jig, and they vary from 6mm right up to 16mm. And as this is a pretty hefty piece of stock, I'm going to choose the 16mm width tenon. Now the tenon bush that goes along with that is a 22mm, and I've installed a 22mm bush in the router. Well, now I'm ready to line the top of this jig up with the center line, and to do that I use the setup bar again and just position it so that the bar sits right over the top of that line that we marked, and then I can lock that in place. The last step is to set the length of the tenon, and to do that you use these adjusting plates. So for the left hand end I'm using the mark here for the 16mm cutter, which is the size of the cutter that we've chosen, and I slide this along until that mark is straight over the top of the pencil line, and lock that in place. Same thing on the right hand side. Slide it up and lock that in place. And the last adjustment I made was to set the depth of cut for the tenon, which is 20mm. Now this collar rides around the inside perimeter of the jig. As long as I keep the collar firmly up against the jig, it'll remove all the material on the outside and leave the tenon in the center. On the first pass, I'm only going to lower the cutter down part way. On all subsequent passes, I'll continue to lower the cutter until I get down to the maximum depth. Now the beauty about a jig like this is, once it's set up, making more tenons is really quick and easy. Well, all the rails get a 10mm deep trench down the inside edge, and that's to receive that tongue and groove paneling. I've installed a 15.5mm cutter in the router table, and I'll make 2 passes to remove all the material. Well, here's all our 8 rails finished. The next thing I want to do is mark out the positions for the mortises in each of the posts. The 4 posts receive 4 tenons, 2 for the long sides and 2 for the short sides, and we're going to do that over on the router table. Well, I spent a few minutes marking up the fence with some indicator lines, and these lines represent where I'm going to start and stop the cuts for the mortises. These 2 lines here represent the outside edges of the cutter. This line is 10mm from the edge of the cutter, and that's the distance between the edge of the tenon and the edge of the board. This line here is where I'm going to stop the cut, and the distance between that line and the edge of the cutter will give us a mortise to receive this tenon. I've also installed the router bit in the table and raised it 12mm above the surface of the table because I need to make 2 passes on a piece of wood this size. With the fence set 15mm from the cutter, I can then drop the board onto the cutter and pull it back until it's just in line with the start point, and then push it all the way through to the finish line, and then remove the timber. Well, this is a really handy little gadget to help me set the height of cutters. I can just raise the bit to 25mm. And I can make a final pass. Well, that's a good fit. Now I'll use all the other indicator lines on the fence to cut the remaining mortises. Well, all the mortises and the posts are now complete. Next detail I want to add is a chamfer which will run down the outside edge of all the posts. I've put a mark where I'll start and stop the cut. And I've installed a chamfering bit in the router, and it has a little ball bearing on here, so there's no need for a fence. And the last thing I want to do to all the posts is to add a chamfer on all 4 sides at the bottom. The reason I want to do that is if the chest gets dragged along the deck, it could chip and split the bottom of the posts. By adding a chamfer here, it'll stop that happening, and I'm going to do that on the sanding station. Well, that looks pretty good. Now when we come back, I'm going to start working on the tongue and grooves for the panelling. Well, welcome back to the Great British Woodshop. Today's project is to build an attractive case to surround a plastic cool box. It's made from Iroko, which is a great choice of wood for an outdoor piece of furniture. Earlier I worked on the posts and the rails for the base, and now I'm cutting to length the panels that will complete the sides. Now I'm going to cut the tongue and grooves in all of the panelling, and I've got a head start because there's nearly 50 pieces of panel in this project. Now, tongue and groove panelling is made up of boards with a tongue down one side and a groove down the other. And there's also a chamfer that runs down both the edges. And when you put the two pieces together, it forms a very attractive panel. Now, to cut these, I'm using a self-guiding match lining set. And I just wanted to show you how this cutter is assembled. This bottom section here removes the lower half of the material and adds the chamfer. This bearing inside here determines the length of the tongue, and the top cutter removes the rest of the material. Now, I've also installed a lead-in pin here because I'm not using the fence, and that enables me to put the work up against the pin, bring it into the cutter, and then move it through safely. Now, the beauty of this match lining set is that I don't need to replace the bit in the router or change the height. So I've disassembled the setup we had for the tongue, and now I'm just rearranging the components so we can cut the grooves. Now, this wood is known as Chlorophylla excelsa, or more commonly known as Iroko, and it's a very oily wood, like teak is. And the benefit of having an oily wood is that it makes the wood impermeable to weather, which makes it a good choice for an outdoor project. The drawback of an oily wood is that it also prevents the glue from getting a very good bond in the joint. So I always wipe down all the joints with some cellulose thinner before I glue it up. Now, you could use white spirits for that, but the flash point on cellulose thinners is higher, which means it evaporates more quickly. I'm applying a waterproof glue to both the tenons and the mortises. Now, all I'm doing now is just sliding the panels into the grooves, and I'm making sure that I keep the chamfers towards the outside. And I've also paid some attention to the colour so I can get some variation in the panel. On this last piece, I've removed the tongue off the top so it sits flush with the rest of the panelling. Well, I can just apply some glue to the top of the tenons, and I'm applying some glue into the mortises here also. I'll set the whole lot in the clamps. And I'm using a couple of spacer blocks just to prevent the damage to the Iroko. I'm wiping off the excess glue, and then I'm going to check it for square. And from corner to corner, that is 895 and 895. That's good. Now I'll repeat the same process on the back. The next thing I want to do is start building this inner frame, and it serves three purposes. It gives me a place to hinge the lid to the chest. It also serves as an anchor point here for the safety chain, and that's to prevent the lid from being pushed too far back. And the third thing it does is hold the cool box securely in place. And it does that by sitting around the edge of this rim. Now the two important measurements are outside to outside across the width and outside to outside across the length. And that will give me the inside dimension for the frame. Now, cutting miters is difficult at the best of times, particularly with wide stock. And the best way I've found to cut them is on the table saw. I've set up two sliding miter gauges on my table saw and set them both to 45 degrees. Now, just to make sure that in combination with each other I have a 90-degree angle, I'm using a framing square, and that's fine. Now I'll cut one side of the miter using the left-hand gauge and the other side of the miter using the right-hand gauge, and that'll ensure a perfect square. I'm going to join all four pieces of the frame together with some more of that waterproof glue and some number 10 biscuits. I'm using a band clamp to hold this frame together until it's dry. I'm checking it for square, 918, and that's just fine. Well, both the long panels are now dry and I've taken them out of the clamps. I've also cleaned off both the mortise and the tenon with some more of that cellulose thinners. And now I'm getting ready to apply some glue to both surfaces. The panels just get slid in between the rails and no glue on those, because I want these panels to be able to move with any changes in humidity. Okay, all the glue's applied, and with a bit of luck, it should all just fit together. That's good. Now that I have these clamped, I can get started on the lid. Well, I've mitered all of the pieces of the lid at 45 degrees. Now I want to add a little bit of elegance to our chest. And the way I'm going to do that is by adding a 15-degree bevel to the outside edge of all of the lid pieces. Now I could just tip my blade over, as I've done, to 15 degrees and push the piece through. But by the time I get to the middle, my fingers are going to be dangerously close to the blade, far too close for my liking. So what I've done is built a little jig that just rides over the top of the rip fence. Put a little stop on this end to secure it, and then I can just put a clamp across the top. I'll just hold it in place, and then I can push it through, and it works great. With a slot cutting bit installed in the router table, I'm going to cut a groove down the inside edge of all four pieces. That groove will receive the tenons on the end of the tongue and groove paneling. Using my homemade sled, I'm cutting tenons in the ends of all the tongue and groove paneling. I've installed a straight cutting bit in the router table and raised it to the right height. One last thing I need to do before I can glue up the lid is to add a chamfer to the end of all the tongue and groove paneling. I also want to run a chamfer around the inside edge of all of the pieces of the frame and on the center stile. Well, it's the moment of truth. Will it all fit together? And so far, so good. Well, no glue yet. This is just a dry fit to make sure that it all fits together. And it does. Well, I'll put some glue on that and we can put it aside to dry. The first step in attaching the inner frame to the base is to drill some pilot holes to keep the wood from splitting. This next step will hide the screw heads, and then I'll fill the recess later with some wooden plugs. I've just attached the inner frame to the chest temporarily, and I'm drilling some holes for the safety chain. To stop the safety chain pulling through, I've just attached a nut to the bottom of the chain and held it in place with a little cable tie. Later, I'll attach the end of the chain to the lid, and the nut will prevent the lid from being opened too far. The rim of the cool box sits in this opening. That's what stops it sliding around. I've just spread some slats out across the bottom here, and these will support the cool box. And I'm just adding a couple of cleats, and we'll attach the slats to those cleats. And I'm going to tack these in place with a couple of brads. The brads were only there to hold the cleats in place until I could attach them properly with some 40mm stainless steel screws. And I'm adding the same to these slats. I'm using stainless because they won't rust and they won't stain the wood. I've reassembled all the parts of the chest, and I've cut some wooden plugs over on a scrap of Iroko at the drill press. They just pop out with a screwdriver, like that. I'm going to just apply some glue. Spread it around. Just slip it into the hole. When I've got all 8 screw holes covered, I'll trim off all the plugs with a saw and then give them a final sanding until they're flush with the frame. Well, we're almost done with this project. Next, I'm going to attach the lid to the frame, and I'm going to do that with a couple of brass hinges. I've installed a homemade jig, and the collar that I've got in the base of my router will run around the inside of the jig. I've set the depth of the bit so that when I'm finished, the top of the hinge will sit flush with the lid. Here's a handy gadget. It's a corner chisel, and I use it to clean up the corner of the mortise. And I'll just clean out the rest with this hand chisel. Let's see if this fits. It's a beautiful thing. Well, remember, the lid is bigger than the chest by 10mm on all 4 sides, and that gave us that lovely shadow line detail. So I came up 10mm before I cut the recess for the hinge in the lid. Now I've given the project a thorough sanding, and I'm ready to apply a water-based finish. Now this finish has UV inhibitors in it, which will help protect the wood from turning grey. And just apply it with a foam brush. And then I'll leave it to dry for about an hour, give it a sanding, give it another coat, and then put on the hardware, and I'll be ready for a cold drink. Well, this is a great addition to the deck. All I need now is a reclining sun lounger to go with it. Maybe that'll be one of my next projects. I'm David Free. I hope you come and see me again in the Great British Woodshop.